There's a reason why some people manage to navigate social wars, toxic environments, and psychological games almost unscathed, while others, even intelligent, good, and hard-working ones, end up constantly manipulated, used, or emotionally destroyed. And no, this doesn't happen because they lack goodness. The truth is much more uncomfortable. People who are too good are often too predictable. And the moment someone can predict your emotions, your reactions, and your limits, you cease to be a free person and begin to become an easy pawn in someone else's game. Machiavelli understood this centuries ago. While the world taught idealized morality, he observed real human nature. He observed envy, self-interest, silent manipulation, invisible power games. And he realized something that remains frighteningly relevant today. The greatest winners are rarely the strongest, the most honest, or the loudest. They are almost always those who have learned to see what no one else sees. The problem is that most people have been trained to believe that over-explaining demonstrates maturity, that excessive availability demonstrates value, and that unilateral justice will be automatically rewarded. But the real world doesn't work that way. In many cases, the more transparent you are, the easier you become to control. The more accessible, the more devalued. The more predictable, the more manipulable. And perhaps this explains why so many people live emotionally exhausted without understanding exactly why. They are playing fair in environments where others have already understood that perception is worth more than intention. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals. That was the essence of Machiavelli's vision. Not because he admired gratuitous cruelty, but because he understood that emotional naivete is costly, very costly. And that's exactly why in this video you'll understand the 7 psychological and strategic secrets that Machiavelli used to win without being seen. Secrets that don't involve shouting, caricatured manipulation, or trying to dominate others by force, but dominating something much more powerful: your reactions, your image, your timing, and what you choose to reveal or hide. Because in the end, the most dangerous people rarely seem dangerous at first glance. And perhaps after this video, you'll never see certain interactions the same way again. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos. It's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul, an invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now. Not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. There's a stark difference between being a good person and being a predictable person. Most people never realize this, and that's precisely where the problem begins. Those who always act the same way, always respond politely, and try to maintain an impeccable image end up offering others a complete manual on how to manipulate them. It sounds harsh, but that's exactly how experienced players observe the world. They study patterns, reactions, timing, emotions. A man who never says no, for example, conveys more information than he realizes. Just put a little pressure on him, create guilt, add urgency, and presto, he moves exactly as expected. Machiavelli understood this almost surgically. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, starts from the principle that human beings rarely play fair when there's an advantage involved. And here's the detail that almost no one mentions. Excessively correct people believe that others think like them. That's the fatal mistake. The upright person thinks that transparency generates automatic respect, when often it only facilitates the calculations of others. It's like playing cards, showing half your hand and still expecting to win. It's curious. The more a person insists on proving they are good, the easier it becomes to anticipate them. Because the world doesn't reward emotional naivete. It rewards perception. Consider corporate environments, for example. The most competent employee isn't always the one who rises. Often, those who climb the ladder understand timing, social reading, and the appearance of virtue. Does that seem unfair? Perhaps. But decisions based on real human nature almost never align with the pretty speeches people post online. The predictable professional accepts too many tasks, responds too quickly, demonstrates loyalty too early, and believes that effort alone will suffice. Meanwhile, someone more strategic observes silently, calculates alliances, and learns where to use or avoid being hated. This doesn't mean becoming cold or manipulative. It means understanding that kindness without strategic perception becomes an invitation to exploitation. A simple example of this happens in relationships. The person who is always available tends to lose emotional value quickly, not because being present is bad, but because the absence of boundaries destroys tension, mystery, and respect. Notice how emotionally strong individuals rarely over-explain themselves at the beginning. They observe first. They test the environment first. As Machiavelli said, it's better to be feared than loved, not in the literal sense of raw fear, but in the sense of not being perceived as easily manipulated. Those who project excessive predictability lose psychological depth in the eyes of others. And sooner or later someone notices this. The most dangerous thing is that exploitation rarely begins aggressively. It starts small. A favor here, a fault there, a seemingly innocent comment. A social test disguised as a joke. Skilled players don't come in kicking down doors. They enter through the emotional crack you left open. And that's where many confuse maturity with silent submission. Constant adaptability doesn't mean accepting everything. It means understanding when to advance, when to retreat, and when to simply observe without revealing intentions. Some of the strongest men in history seemed calm, precisely because they controlled what others could read in them. Think of strategic figures like Julius Caesar or even modern business leaders who speak little in the most important negotiations. Silence creates discomfort because it forces the other side to fill the void. And almost always, those who talk too much give away too much information. There's a reason why having one's own loyal armies was so important to Machiavelli. Emotional dependence on others has always been costly. The same logic applies to personal life. Those who build internal validation stop begging for external approval, and when that happens, something silently changes in the social dynamic, because people start to realize that maybe you're not as easy to reach as you seemed. And interestingly, it's precisely at this point that the game really starts to change. There's a silent art to appearing less dangerous than you actually are. And almost no one masters this, because the modern ego has been trained to display strength all the time. People want to prove their intelligence, show results, reveal achievements ahead of time, and make it clear that they are capable. But strategic players understand something that Machiavelli would repeat without hesitation. Whoever reveals power too early awakens resistance too early. The man who enters a room trying to impress usually loses access to the most valuable information in that room. Because the moment others see him as a threat, they automatically begin to hide their intentions, measure their words, and construct masks. Now observe the opposite. The underestimated individual moves through environments almost invisibly. People relax around him. They talk more, they reveal more, they lower their guard, and in doing so, they deliver exactly what a strategist needs: real emotional patterns. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, means understanding that the world works much more by perception than by absolute truth. It's not about lying, it's about controlling exposure. There is a difference. An intelligent businessman, for example, rarely enters negotiations showing all the cash he possesses. An experienced fighter doesn't reveal all their moves before the fight begins. And someone who is emotionally strong doesn't unload all their depth in the first few conversations. Because information is power, and excessive transparency almost always diminishes your advantage. Most people associate discretion with insecurity. That's a mistake. Often, the most dangerous person at the table is precisely the calmest one, the most observant, the one who listens more than speaks. Machiavelli understood that an appearance of virtue and image control were fundamental tools for surviving in competitive environments. And this remains incredibly relevant today. Notice how truly influential people rarely feel the need to prove their influence every 5 minutes. They let the environment discover it little by little. This creates curiosity, discomfort, and respect at the same time. Those who try to convince all the time end up transmitting emotional neediness, and emotional neediness weakens the perception of authority. Imagine someone who mentions money in every conversation, or someone who forces constant demonstrations of intelligence. After a while, the effect becomes exactly the opposite, because real security is silent. There are multi-millionaire executives who enter meetings wearing simple clothes precisely to avoid triggering immediate defensive mechanisms. There are investors who feign disinterest to hear more details before acting. There are emotionally strong people who appear vulnerable only to understand the extent of the other person's intentions. Does the end justify the means? In highly competitive environments, many play exactly like that, even if they would never admit it out loud. And those who ignore this often become pawns in the game without realizing it. Perhaps the hardest point to accept is this: demonstrating everything you are eliminates part of your strategic power. This applies to intelligence, ambition, emotions, and even financial capacity. Whoever controls what they reveal controls part of the narrative around them. And no, this doesn't mean living by manipulating people like a cold movie character. It simply means understanding that excessive exposure creates unnecessary vulnerabilities. A simple example occurs on social media. People who show every step of their lives offer enough material for envy, judgment, sabotage, and complete behavioral analysis. Meanwhile, more strategic individuals share only what is necessary. They understand the calculated use of force. Not every battle needs a demonstration. Not every victory needs an audience. Better to be feared than loved can also mean something much more subtle: being perceived as someone impossible to fully understand, because indecipherable people generate natural caution, and caution changes other people's behavior without the need for direct confrontation. Curiously, the greatest strategists in life rarely seemed the strongest at first glance. Many seemed ordinary, almost too discreet. But there was an invisible difference. They understood when to speak, when to back down, and when to let others believe they were in control. And that's exactly where a type of advantage begins that few people can see until it's too late. Few things weaken a position as much as the constant need to justify oneself. And the most curious thing is that almost no one realizes when they start falling into this trap. It all begins in a seemingly innocent way. The person wants to avoid misunderstandings, wants to appear fair, wants to ensure that the other understands their intentions. So they over-explain, they over-detail, they try too hard to convince. But the moment someone enters this state, something silently changes in the dynamics of the conversation. They hand over the role of judge to the other person. And experienced players notice this immediately. Machiavelli understood that authority rarely arises from the need for approval. On the contrary, the more someone tries to validate their actions before others, the more insecurity they transmit about their own decision. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, means understanding that communication is not just about words, it's about psychological position. Observe strong leaders in moments of pressure. They don't engage in long emotional defenses to justify every move. They say what is necessary. They maintain firmness. Because excessive explanation creates space for excessive questioning. And manipulative people love that. They ask questions not to understand, but to gather emotional information. Every detail you provide becomes strategic data about your insecurities, fears, triggers, and limitations. Imagine a common situation. A man decides to distance himself from someone who has repeatedly disrespected him. Instead of simply acting, he writes lengthy texts trying to explain why he's hurt, why he made that decision, and why he wants to be understood. It seems like maturity, but often it's just fear of disapproval disguised as dialogue. Meanwhile, the other side coldly analyzes everything. Where did he hesitate? Where did he show guilt? Where can he still be emotionally pressured? This is why emotionally strong people tend to be more economical with words in critical moments. Not because they are cold, but because they understand the calculated use of force. And few forces are greater than the ability to remain firm without needing constant convincing. Better to be feared than loved takes on another meaning here. Being perceived as someone who doesn't beg for emotional validation. Notice how respected individuals rarely publicly defend themselves against every criticism. They know that trying to control every external perception is an impossible war. And the more someone tries to completely clean up their own image, the more they convey dependence on the opinions of others. For Machiavelli, the appearance of virtue was never about moral naivete. It was about understanding how social perception works in practice. And in practice, excessive explanation almost always diminishes psychological presence. There's also an extremely uncomfortable detail. Many people provoke precisely to extract explanations. They create vague accusations, distorted interpretations, or strategic silences because they know that emotionally anxious individuals will try to defend themselves immediately. And those who defend themselves too much usually lose control of the interaction. Think about negotiations, family arguments, or even social media. How many times does a strong person actually win an argument through persistence? Almost never. True mastery lies in controlling reaction, timing, and emotional exposure. Having one's own loyal armies doesn't just exist in a military sense. Emotionally speaking, it means building enough internal stability to not depend on external approval at every step. There are business people who have lost millions because they talk too much in meetings. There are relationships destroyed by excessive justifications, where one person spent so much time trying to prove their innocence that they ended up seeming guilty. Decisions based on real human nature show something important. Those who remain calm under pressure generally control their perception of the situation. And perhaps that's why silence is so unsettling, because silence forces the other person to deal with themselves, without access to their emotions, without access to their weaknesses, without access to their inner map. And when someone realizes they can no longer easily predict their partner's reactions, the entire dynamic of the relationship begins to silently change. People imagine manipulation as something explicit, a frontal attack, an obvious betrayal, an aggressive argument. But the most dangerous players rarely operate that way. They understand that direct confrontations generate resistance, so they do something much more sophisticated. They shape the environment before the victim realizes the game. Machiavelli observed this in politics all the time. Kings didn't fall just because of battles. Often they fell because someone slowly altered the perception around them. A comment here: a doubt planted there, a strategic silence at the right moment. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, means accepting that influence rarely happens in an obvious way. It happens through context, and whoever controls context controls interpretation. Think about work environments. An employee is rarely destroyed by open criticism. First, small suggestions begin about their difficulty working in a team. Then, subtle exclusions from important meetings. Next, a small mistake begins to receive disproportionate attention, and when they realize it, the narrative has already been built without the need for a direct attack. The scariest thing is that often no one can pinpoint exactly where it started, because experienced players know how to use the appearance of virtue while moving invisible pieces behind the scenes. And those who believe that every battle will be explicit end up being defeated without even realizing when they entered the battlefield. This also happens in personal relationships all the time. There are people who never confront directly, but create emotional scenarios to make you seem solely guilty. They change their tone of voice around others. They carefully choose the moment of the conversation. They make ambiguous comments in front of the right audience. And then they observe your reaction, because whoever loses emotional control first usually loses psychological ground first. The calculated use of force rarely involves an immediate explosion. It involves silent preparation. A classic example is someone who subtly provokes until the other person explodes publicly. Then they assume a calm, rational, and even concerned posture. The result? The narrative favors the one who seemed more controlled. Better to be feared than loved here takes a different form, becoming someone difficult to destabilize emotionally. Because manipulators need a reaction to consolidate their narrative. When they don't find it, they lose some control of the game. Notice how strong leaders rarely respond immediately under intense pressure. They understand timing, they understand the stage, they understand the audience. Decisions based on real human nature show that people rarely believe only in the facts. They believe in how the facts are presented. And those who ignore this end up in battles trying to use pure logic against invisible emotional strategies. Perhaps the greatest modern naivete is believing that good intentions protect someone from psychological games. They don't. Extremely honest people are often the most vulnerable precisely because they believe that obvious honesty will be enough to dismantle manipulations. But most social wars happen on an emotional and perceptual level, not a rational one. Machiavelli knew this centuries ago. Virtù and fortuna have never depended solely on brute force, but on the ability to read environments and adapt behavior before it's too late. Constant adaptability is what prevents someone from being repeatedly placed in vulnerable positions. And this requires silent observation. Those who talk too much about plans, emotions, and intentions offer too much material for constructing a context against themselves. Observe truly strategic people. They understand the weight of the environment, body language, absence, timing, and even silence. There are business people who let competitors wear themselves down before acting. There are politicians who allow adversaries to talk too much until they contradict themselves publicly. There are emotionally intelligent people who perceive when they are being led toward a specific reaction and simply don't give in. Because the moment you understand that you're rarely being attacked directly, but rather slowly positioned, you begin to see common interactions in a completely different way. There's an uncomfortable difference between being fair and acting as if the whole world obeyed the same principles as you. Most people learn early on that honesty, loyalty, and consistency will always be rewarded, and in an ideal scenario, perhaps they would be. But Machiavelli never analyzed the world as it should be. He observed what really happened when interests, fear, ambition, and survival entered the equation. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, is born precisely from this point. Because when only one side follows rigid rules, while the other plays strategically, the dispute ceases to be balanced. Think of someone who always gives more than they receive in a relationship because they believe that true love requires infinite patience. Or the professional who continues to accept abuse because they think character will be automatically recognized. The problem is that manipulative people interpret excessive tolerance as silent permission. And the more predictable your moral reaction, the easier it will be to calculate how far they can go with you. This doesn't mean abandoning principles. It means understanding that principles without strategic perception can turn into emotional chains. Does the end justify the means? In many competitive environments, people act exactly as if this phrase were an invisible law, even if they post motivational quotes on social media the next day. One of the most dangerous traps is believing that always responding calmly and understandingly will solve everything. In some cases it does. In others, it only teaches the other person that there will be no real consequences. And behavior without consequences tends to repeat itself. Decisions based on real human nature require the courage to accept this. There are people who only respect boundaries when they perceive a cost. Not a dramatic emotional cost, but a strategic cost. Distance, coldness, reduced access, change of posture. Better to be feared than loved within this logic means something profoundly practical, being perceived as someone who has real boundaries. Because individuals without clear boundaries end up absorbing disrespect as routine. Observe corporate environments again. Extremely available employees tend to receive more pressure, not more consideration. The boss starts by asking for a favor outside of working hours, then another, then assumes that it's part of the obligation. And slowly, the abuse becomes the norm, not because everyone is ill-intentioned, but because human nature tests available spaces. Calculated use of force is not an emotional outburst. It's knowing exactly when to harden your stance to prevent the environment from normalizing your devaluation. Even in financial negotiations, this is evident. Those who accept everything too quickly lose bargaining power immediately. Those who demonstrate excessive need generally receive the worst conditions. The world responds much more to the perception of value than to discourses about merit. Perhaps that's why so many good people end up emotionally exhausted. They spend years trying to win tough games using only one-sided idealism. And when they finally realize the dynamics they were in, they already carry resentment, weariness, and a deep sense of injustice. Machiavelli understood that the appearance of virtue was often more politically useful than naive virtue without strategic protection. This is unsettling because it dismantles the fantasy that good intentions are enough to survive in any environment. It's not enough. Having one's own loyal armies can also be interpreted emotionally. Building enough psychological autonomy to not depend on the approval of people who constantly test your worth. And here's a powerful detail. Those who learn to calibrate their responses stop reacting automatically. Instead of offering the same energy to everyone, they begin to observe merit, reciprocity, and context. Constant adaptability is not falsehood, it's emotional intelligence applied to concrete reality. There are people who confuse firmness with cruelty simply because they have never learned to deal with someone who doesn't silently accept everything. And it's curious to see how other people's behavior changes when you stop rewarding disrespect with endless understanding. Suddenly, some people distance themselves. Others start measuring their words. Others show respect they never showed before. And all this happens without shouting, without long speeches, and without needing to prove anything. Simply because the dynamic is no longer comfortable for those who were previously playing alone. Few people realize that urgency is one of the most widely used psychological tools for controlling human decisions. When someone manages to accelerate their emotions, they automatically reduce their clarity, and experienced players know this very well. Machiavelli understood that whoever controls the pace of an interaction often also controls its outcome. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, means understanding that pressure rarely appears by chance. It is usually created strategically. Observe how many bad decisions happen under phrases like, "Decide now," "This is your last chance," "You need to respond today," or "If you don't do this immediately, you'll lose." The human brain under urgency enters reaction mode, not perception mode. And in this state, people reveal weaknesses, accept bad conditions, and give away information they would normally hide. Think about negotiations. The desperate buyer almost always pays more. The emotional investor enters late and exits too early. The anxious man sends impulsive messages that he would later like to delete. The emotionally pressured woman accepts situations she would normally refuse. The entire modern environment seems built to prevent deep reflection. Constant notifications, instant responses, immediate reactions. But those who react too quickly are usually playing at the other team's pace, not their own. And playing at the other team's pace is one of the most silent ways to lose strategic position. Sustained silence is unsettling because it breaks emotional expectations. Most people have been conditioned to fill voids immediately, explain quickly, answer quickly, defend quickly, decide quickly. But the individual who can remain calm under pressure completely alters the psychological dynamics of the interaction. Better to be feared than loved can also mean this: becoming someone impossible to accelerate emotionally. Because those who cannot be easily pressured become difficult to manipulate. There are CEOs who purposefully delay responding to multi-million-dollar proposals precisely to observe who starts showing anxiety first. There are experienced negotiators who use long pauses during meetings because they know that silence makes the other person talk more than they should. Calculated use of force often doesn't involve acting, it involves waiting. And this requires a rare kind of self-control. Notice how emotionally fragile people feel a constant need to resolve everything immediately. Any discomfort becomes an urgency. Any tension becomes an impulse. Machiavelli knew that decisions made in the heat of the moment almost always favor the one who provoked the heat. Therefore, strategic individuals slow down before responding to provocations, invitations, conflicts, or seemingly perfect opportunities. Decisions based on real human nature show that heightened emotion reduces critical perception, and when critical perception disappears, external influence silently grows. Perhaps one of the most powerful skills in modern life is simply not reacting at the expected speed. This seems small, but it changes absolutely everything. Imagine someone trying to provoke you in a conversation. Instead of responding instantly, you observe, breathe, maintain a neutral expression. The discomfort shifts immediately, because whoever controls emotional timing controls part of the interaction. Constant adaptability includes knowing when to slow down while the whole world is running around in a panic. There are legendary investors who spent years waiting for the right opportunity, while others destroyed their wealth, trying to act all the time. There are military leaders who won wars not through brute force, but through strategic patience. There are emotionally intelligent people who understood something valuable. Not every message needs an immediate response. Not every provocation deserves a reaction, and not every opportunity is truly urgent. The appearance of virtue also comes into play here in a curious way. Many manipulators simulate concern, haste, or intense emotion just to push for quick decisions. And those who don't realize this end up choosing paths they would never choose in a calm state. Having your own loyal armies emotionally speaking, means building enough internal stability not to depend on the emotional pace imposed by others. Because when you learn to consciously slow down, you start to see things that hurried people simply can't see. And that's exactly where many invisible games stop working. People treat you according to the emotional, psychological, and strategic cost of overstepping your boundaries. This sounds harsh, but it's one of the most ignored truths of adult life. Those who always react the same way, silently accept everything, and maintain unrestricted availability end up creating a dangerous image, that of someone easy to access, predict, and pressure. Machiavelli understood that power doesn't just come from explicit force, but from others' perception of the consequences of certain actions. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, requires accepting that respect rarely comes solely from good intentions. Often it arises when people realize that certain behaviors will have a cost. And no, this doesn't mean becoming aggressive, arrogant, or explosive. On the contrary, truly strong people rarely need to raise their voices. The central point is different, making your boundaries emotionally real. Imagine someone who always responds immediately, always accepts last-minute changes, and always tolerates minor disrespect. The environment quickly learns that there are no concrete consequences to overstepping their boundaries. Now observe someone different. Someone who knows how to distance themselves without drama, who reduces access without announcing it, who changes their posture without needing a long discussion. Other people's behavior changes almost instantly in the presence of this person because they cease to be emotionally cheap to manipulate. Much of human interaction functions through invisible tests, small delays, small ironies, small invasions of emotional space. Not because everyone is wicked, but because human nature constantly gauges its limits. Decisions based on true human nature demonstrate this with brutal clarity. The person who never sets boundaries will be increasingly pressured. Those who silently demonstrate self-worth tend to receive different treatment without constantly needing to demand respect. Better to be feared than loved here takes on an extremely practical interpretation, being perceived as someone whose loss, distancing, or change of attitude would have a real impact. Notice how overly available people are often less valued than those who know how to balance their presence. This happens in friendships, relationships, business, and even within families. Calculated use of force means understanding that emotional energy is also a strategic resource. There are business people who end negotiations the moment they perceive veiled disrespect. There are emotionally strong men and women who don't argue to prove their worth. They simply withdraw access. And curiously, this often generates more respect than 1,000 emotional explanations. The appearance of virtue also comes into play here. Many people feign kindness while silently testing your limits. And those who don't realize it end up in a dynamic where they give more and more and receive less and less. Perhaps the most important point is this. Becoming difficult to manage begins within one's own mind, because those who desperately depend on external acceptance can hardly maintain real boundaries. Having one's own loyal armies in this context means building a strong enough internal foundation not to trade dignity for companionship, validation, or belonging. Constant adaptability isn't about changing one's essence to please environments. It's about developing enough intelligence to perceive where one's energy is being valued or exploited. There are people who spend years trying to convince others of their own worth, when in reality they should simply stop remaining where they are constantly devalued. And this completely changes the psychological dynamics of life. The individual who learns to control reactions, timing, and emotional expression becomes much more difficult to manipulate, because manipulators depend on predictability, they depend on guilt, they depend on emotional impulsiveness. When these doors begin to close, the game silently changes. Machiavelli knew that men respect much more what they cannot completely control. And perhaps that is precisely why some people, even speaking little, carry a presence impossible to ignore. They understood something that most people take decades to realize. True power has never been about dominating others. It has always been about dominating oneself first. Ultimately, Machiavelli was never just teaching about politics. He was teaching about emotional survival, understanding people, and self-control in a world where almost no one plays completely openly. And perhaps the greatest irony is precisely this. True power doesn't belong to the most aggressive person in the room. It belongs to the one who can control themselves while everyone else loses control of their own emotions. Because whoever masters their own silence, their own time, and their own reactions becomes extremely difficult to manipulate. Now think honestly. How many times have you over-explained trying to be understood? How many times have you tolerated disrespect to avoid conflict? How many times have you acted quickly due to emotional pressure and then realized that someone was controlling the pace of the situation? Most people never stop to see these patterns. They just repeat cycles and call it bad luck. But after everything you've heard here, it becomes much harder to continue living on autopilot. Because when you start to understand how the invisible games work, you also begin to realize how many decisions in your life have been influenced by guilt, urgency, the need for approval, and the fear of losing people. And perhaps it is precisely now that everything changes. Not because you will transform into someone cold or cruel, but because you can finally become someone conscious. Someone who understands the calculated use of force. Someone who knows when to speak, when to be silent, and when to simply observe. Someone who no longer hands over their emotional map to just anyone. Machiavelli said that it is better to be feared than loved when one cannot be both. But perhaps the true lesson hidden in this is another. Never allow the world to see you as someone easy to control. So tell me something in the comments. Which of these 7 secrets opened your eyes the most today? And which one do you feel you need to apply to your own life immediately? I want to read your thoughts because often a single insight can completely change how someone navigates the world from now on. And if you want to continue learning about psychological power, human nature, silent strategy, and Machiavelli's deepest teachings, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Because the upcoming videos will likely make you see people, relationships, and even yourself in a way you never have before.